This video is sponsored by Movie Palette. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the Autobots must team up with the Maximals to save Earth in Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. When their planet was devoured by Unicron, voiced by Coleman Domingo, the Maximals, led by Ron Perlman's Optimus Primal, escaped with the Transwarp Key that can open portals through space and time and hid it on Earth. In 1994, museum intern Elena, played by Dominique Fishback, discovers half the key in an ancient artifact and unwittingly opens a beacon that alerts the Autobots, led by Peter Cullen's Optimus Prime, to a way of returning home to Cybertron. Unfortunately, it also draws the attention of Unicron and his Terracons, led by Peter Dinklage' Scourge. With the aid of former soldier Noah Diaz, played by Anthony Ramos, who discovered the Autobots when he tried to steal Mirage, voiced by Pete Davidson, the Autobots must team up with their Maximal counterparts to find the other half of the key and save Earth. In 2017, Michael Bay's Transformers films finally spluttered out with The Last Knight as audiences grew tired of the franchise, which by that point had become bloated and incomprehensible. But a little over a year later, the franchise actually found a bit of salvation in the form of Bumblebee, with Travis Knight stepping into the director's chair. Michael Bay served as a producer on that movie, as he does on Rise of the Beast, but otherwise had very little association with them. Bumblebee served effectively as a soft reboot of the series, this time set in the 80s, and was basically the story of a girl and her car. It was a coming-of-age story that just happened to have giant robots in it, and it actually showed that the Transformers movies could be more than what they'd been previously, which had essentially been explosions with the pretense of a plot bolted onto it. Bumblebee did especially well with Transformers fans, as it was much closer to what they'd envisioned the films to be. Many Transformers fans aren't actually that big on the Michael Bay movies, and critics certainly weren't. But for once, critics and fans really enjoyed a Transformers movie. In fact, I loved Bumblebee when it came out. It was filled with a lot of heart and emotion, which is genuinely something that was a huge surprise to me, because you don't expect that necessarily from a Transformers movie, and I thought that was going to be the route that the Transformers films were going to take from that point forward. Now, 5 years later, we get Transformers: Rise of the Beast, which is set during the 90s. This time, it's directed by Stephen Caple Jr., who previously directed Creed 2. And I've got to be really honest, I was very apprehensive as soon as I saw Transformers back in the title, and I did wonder, were they going to actually squander all the goodwill that Bumblebee had given them and just give us yet another stock standard Transformers movie? And unfortunately, yes. Yes, they did. The issue with Rise of the Beast is that it treats its predecessor like a problem that has to be solved, like a stain on the franchise rather than a blueprint, and it's a big return to formula, and it's kind of depressing, especially because I knew going into it that it wasn't going to be Bumblebee 2. It wasn't marketed like that in any way. I just hoped that some of the things that I liked about Bumblebee would be carried over into this film, but not enough of it, if any, actually survives into this outing, other than the fact that it is nominally set in the same universe that Bumblebee established. This even goes down to the fact the movie largely ignores its predecessor. There are virtually no references or callbacks to that movie, with the exception of one very brief passing conversation where Optimus Prime tells Bumblebee, "Yes, I remember when you had a good interaction with a human." That's it. That's your callback to Bumblebee. Thanks for resetting the franchise. but get out of the room now. I do have to admit that I was still holding out some hope in the early section of this movie as it established its new human characters in the form of Noah and Elena. Noah used to be in the army, he used to work in communications, but now that he's out of the army, he's struggling to hold down a job. He does have skills, he's very good at mechanics and technical stuff, but unfortunately that is underappreciated, and that is something that Elena knows all too well. She has the museum internship job, but all of the work that she puts into that is largely taken credit for by her boss. Her boss just gives her a lot of busy work, like getting the coffees or doing her laundry. You can get the sense that both these characters are struggling with microaggressions from those that are in charge. There's a moment where Noah is trying to get a job and the boss says that, oh, I can't have someone like you on board. And that's kind of left hanging with the, well, what do you mean, someone like me? And he's trying to play it off as, oh, well, I talked to some of the people in the army and they said you didn't really work very well in a team, but clearly what was meant is felt. Both of them want to rise above their particular stations. The problem is that once the plot starts, this immediately goes out the window. There are a lot of prominent subplots in the first act of this movie, like the fact that Noah has a little brother with sickle cell disease, and the family is struggling to pay for his hospital bills. That is why Noah wants a job so badly. He not just wants to provide for his family, he also wants to provide for his brother, and so that is the motivating factor in all his decisions in the early portion of the movie. That is why he turns to his friend and tries to steal Mirage, because he wants to get the money from selling it to pay for his brother's treatment. That is a big part of the movie. They establish it really early on, and then it just kind of goes out of the movie, effectively, until the epilogue. And it's such a weird decision because there's an entire sequence where Noah goes back to their apartment to tell their brother that they're going out on this adventure because he wants to save him, in addition to saving the rest of the world. And when the brother hears of this, he goes, I want to come too, I want to join you. And I would have kept that character around, but instead, Noah goes, you can't, because someone's got to look after Mum. And I go, the mum that has only appeared in one scene of this movie and then disappeared completely off the face of the earth, Luna Lauren Velez, again popping up in a summer blockbuster after Across the Spider-Verse, literally has maybe 2 minutes of screen time and somehow gets third billing for that, and her character effectively disappears like the entire rest of the supporting cast. Like, everyone set up in the first act of the movie just completely vanishes. Any lingering plot threads are just kind of very quickly wrapped up in the final moments of the movie. That's such strange writing. It is almost like they took the draft of one script and then bolted it onto a script of something completely different. And that probably is what happened, because there are 5 credited writers on this movie, which suggests to me that there have been a lot of rewrites in this production, to say the least, and boy, does the end result show that. And after the first New York section of the movie, the rest of it is effectively set in Peru, which I will have to give credit for. It is actually a unique location among Hollywood blockbusters. You don't see a lot of big mainstream movies set in Peru, and certainly the location workers provide a lot of great cinematography. It's extremely photogenic. Unfortunately, on a writing level, what they've done is that they've set up the characters in one location, then plucked out 2 of them into another location that they have no connection with whatsoever, which effectively nullifies any of the personality that they've set up previously. The human characters in this movie are just incredibly generic. They are literally there to forward plot points. And I know that there's a lot of people going, well, people don't go to Transformers films to see the humans in it. Yes, but they do take up a lot of screen time. And I don't think that this is a case where they were listening to fans complain that there were too many humans in the previous Transformers films. I think what actually necessitated this decision is that this filmed in 2021. This is one of the first films that started up during the pandemic, and so that means the fact that we have only 2 human characters for the vast majority of the running time is largely a concession to that. They don't have any chemistry with each other because they hardly even know each other. They are literally smashed together by circumstance, and then just a few hours later they're agreeing to drop their entire lives to go to Peru to save the world. There's very little justification for why it's these two particular characters on this particular quest. In fact, I would have changed it so that the characters would have at least been aware of each other or knew each other from being in the same neighbourhood. The film doesn't even give us that particular aspect of it. The result is really boring characters. There's not a lot of interest to them. Like, Ramos is playing a character that is meant to be motivated by his brother that is barely even mentioned in the middle portion of the film. It's so frustrating. Like, why would you set up so much stuff that has very little payoff in the grand scheme of things? Fishback somehow fares even worse. I don't think she knows how to handle a film of this particular scale. I think she kind of gets lost in it, especially later on in the film, where effectively she's on her own and her only co-stars are a bunch of robots that are going to be added in later. Although it does have to be said, they did actually attempt to give the robots personality, which was something that was missing in the Michael Bay movies, where often they were shunted into the background, given very broad strokes personalities, but largely indistinguishable from one another. Here, they are actually given character arcs in some cases. In particular, Optimus Prime is actually given an arc of having to learn how to trust humans. Bumblebee is, of course, telling him that humans can help them, but Optimus, over the first portion of this movie, is ruining the fact that Noah is aware of their presence, and worse, that they have to try and trust him. And this coincides with Noah's thinking, in that Noah doesn't know if he can trust the Autobots, and so the key serves as an actual area of conflict for them, in that Optimus really wants to use the key to try and get back to Cybertron, but Noah doesn't trust the Autobots to not sacrifice the Earth in doing so. And so that means that Noah actually is thinking of maybe slightly betraying the Autobots by destroying the key as a way of saving the Earth first and foremost. And so that is actually an interesting area of the movie that I wish was given a little bit more expansion here. It does actually give a little bit of drama to the proceedings that is desperately lacking. A lot of the time, though, this personality largely comes from stunt casting, and this is probably most successful with the character of Mirage, played by Pete Davidson. And of course, being an SNL alum, he brings a lot of humour to his role. I'm not always the biggest fan of Davidson, and sometimes I can find him a little bit annoying, and that was kind of the case here. He brings a lot of his awkward energy to it, where he's kind of bringing lines like, "Yeah, you were inside me," and things like that. And there was a certain point where I just went, could you just be quiet? But the stunt casting of celebrities backfires because several of them are totally underutilised. Michelle Yeoh is essentially living out the Oscar curse by having her first role after winning Best Actress be a role as a maximal transformer. She can transform into a falcon, and she does provide a certain regal elegance with her voice work, but otherwise, it's a role that provides very little other than a lot of exposition to be delivered, but at least that Yeoh can be discerned apart from the rest of the action, which is more than can be said for Peter Dinklage, who, I've got to be honest, I wasn't even aware was in this movie until I started researching for this review. I should very quickly mention that the celebrity voice cast in this movie aren't billed in the main titles at the end of the film, they're billed in the closing credits properly, which I didn't stick around for. But Dinklage is voicing Scourge, where effectively it could have been played by anyone. There really isn't all that much to the role other than scowling threats the entire time. The only time I actually noticed maybe Dinklage in the entire role was very early on when he talks about the planet being savoury. That is the only moment where the character seems to have any real personality other than growling, "I'm going to kill you, Optimus. It would be a shame not to kill you, Optimus, and so on and so forth. It's a real waste of Dinklage's talents. But, as I said, it's back to business as usual. It's the same old Transformers movie, whether it's set in 1994 or not. The Transformers have been here for years. They have ancient artifacts, and we have to go running around in caves to find them. There's one where Elena actually says, "This is some Indiana Jones shit," which reads like a moment in the script that said, "Insert quip here," and then they went with the most obvious thudding suggestion. Everything in this movie feels really derivative of what Bay did in his movies, especially in terms of the plotting. And what I will say is that in some areas it is an improvement on the Bay movies, in that, for a start, it has a much shorter, much more tolerable 2-hour running time as opposed to the near 3-hour bloat of the Bay movies, but also it's much more coherent, and certainly it has much less offensive things about it. Unfortunately, it's also a far less interesting movie. I spent a lot of Rise of the Beast being incredibly bored by it. And I'm not saying that the Bay films were good, because they weren't, but at least you could watch them with a certain kind of fascination. You could watch them and be mortified at them, and you go, how could he be allowed to do this? Why was he allowed to do that in what is effectively an adaptation of a children's toy? You won't find that in Rise of the Beast. But that might actually be to its detriment overall, because honestly, there is so little in this film that isn't a total retread. It doesn't help that the movie leans on these big emotional moments where characters sacrifice themselves, and I just sat there in the audience going, well, you're obviously not going to follow through with that, are you? You don't have the Devastator balls to do that. And sure enough, in the 3 examples of it I can think of in this movie, 2 of them are reversed by the end of the running time, and one of them is especially obvious because the movie basically goes, do you remember the big notorious Transformers plot point, the one that Michael Bay has already done in one of his earlier Transformers films? Well, what if we did that really blatantly, but then did it with another character? Except the surprise in that case is negated by the fact you know it's going to be reversed, and sure enough, in Act 3, here comes the Deus Ex Machina. Oh look, that sacrifice wasn't much of one at all now, was it? I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask me, well, what's the action scenes like at the very least? The Bay films are notorious for the fact that the fight scenes had the camera way too close to the robots, which, yes, amplified their scale, but made the battles between them very hard to read visually. And that is improved in Rise of the Beast, just as it was in Bumblebee. The action is much further back, so we can actually see the robots fighting on screen, and Capital Jr. does make them intelligible. The problem is that when I think back upon the movie, I can't think of a moment that I was actually wowed by in the action sequences, or real kind of distinctive moment. Yes, there are some continuous shots. Yes, there are some flashy wonders that are probably really technically difficult, but there's nothing that really stands out. Most of the time, it's just fairly generic action, and that is a shame, because even the Bay films had their moments, but Rise of the Beast, again, just largely chugs along on fumes. Actually, even though visually it's more coherent, the set pieces are still all over the place in terms of geography. A good example of this is a sequence in the middle of the film where they go down into these caves in a town in Peru, and then the human characters get attacked in that cave, and the Autobots that are waiting in the town that is right next to the cave, they go to their aid, and then suddenly we get this big action set piece on the side of a hill, and I go, well, weren't they right next to where the opening to that cave was? What's happened here? So we get this big action sequence while the human characters are running around in this cave. They eventually exit in a rainforest, which must be miles and miles away from where they entered in that town in Peru. Eventually, the Autobots manage to catch up with them, but that means that the human characters have ran at least 50 miles in underground cave? Like, the geography of where things are happening in relation to each other in that 10-minute stretch of the movie are just absolutely as bewildering as anything that happens in the Michael Bay action sequences. Just in a much more subtle level where you don't immediately notice it unless you go, wait, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's before we get into the final 20 to 25 minutes where it turns into the dreaded CGI climax that has been the blight of blockbusters for about a decade now, where instead of scenic Peru, how about you get a big grey war zone instead? Basically, it's a lot of robots smashing into each other for the climax, while the humans run around on green screens for most of it. And this is where the writing of the movie especially takes a big dip, as there are some pretty laughable moments in the final act of this movie, including one moment where a walkie-talkie from Peru manages to pick up a signal from New York so that Noah can get a pep talk from his brother in the climax of the movie. Yeah, great, the film finally remembered that particular character, could have done so in a way which wasn't completely implausible and ridiculous. Yeah, I'm sure some Transformers fan is going to go, well, it was probably Energon that probably did that. No, it's just really silly. Not as much as what immediately follows that, where Noah actually turns into Iron Man. Yes, that happens at the finale of this movie, and the effects are really, really bad. Do you remember how everyone was complaining about the CGI for Robert Downey Jr. in the later MCU films where he had floaty head syndrome? Yeah, well, guess what? That's in the Transformers movies now. Noah turns into Floaty Headman for the ending of this film. And I was groaning at this development, as Noah was taking on Transformers that were 3 to 4 times his size and would probably be able to squish him like a bug, but actually he was managing to somehow overpower them. And that's not even getting into the stuff that happens at the very end of the climax, where apparently things like scale or the effects of gravitational physics are just completely ignored on a shot-to-shot basis. And then, as the creme de la creme, the final scene of the movie, which I have my suspicions was probably meant to be a mid-credits scene that they switched around during post-production because they realised that most people would probably walk out before this moment because they weren't especially happy with the movie, and that was certainly the case in my screening. The final scene of this movie involves a tease of a shared universe that I'm pretty sure no one is actually interested in. No one in the fan base really wants that particular collaboration. The only people that would be excited about this are Hasbro executives, who I'm sure are salivating at the prospect of this, but I think most people will go, wait, what? As well as going, well, how would that even remotely work? And I'm not really convinced that they're going to follow through on it, if I'm being totally honest. I don't think the returns from this movie are going to justify having a big crossover event like they seem to be teasing. Transformers Rise of the Beast is a contradiction in that technically it is a better film than the Michael Bay movies that it's trying to emulate, but it's also a far less interesting one, and it doesn't have all that much personality about it. Anything that sets up early on is largely abandoned for just a generic adventure quest. Worse, it does a lot of stuff that the previous Transformers movies have already done, and largely does it in exactly the same way. Instead of following the example of Bumblebee and trying to do something new, maybe even something character-based, instead it's back to crashy bang bang a lot of the time. It's exactly back to where it was in 2017, feeling tired, exhausted, and running out of gas. You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FILMBRAIN15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can roll out to my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. Those all help as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.